Ja sam Semir Sejfović i dobrodošli u emisiju Plenum Grid. Večeras razgovaramo sa Samijem Hamdijem, jednim od velikih pisaca, mislioca modernog doba po pitanju islamskih pitanja, politike, Palestine, kao i generalno borbe za ljudska prava. Sami, thank you very much for joining us here in Sarajevo. And you're quite known here in Bosnia and beyond the borders. Many people do follow you. I've had many requests from people to discuss one very important topic, which is a big question on the minds of Muslims who are far away from the Middle East. The question that I myself get, which I would like to discuss with you, is why are the politics of the Arab states in the Middle East so negligent towards the Palestinian question? Why are we not seeing political leaders pull their weight, so to say, if we considered the money, the resources, the development that is present in the Middle East?
Thank you very much for having me, and it's great to be here. And everybody knows that Bosnia, in particular, has a very special place in my heart. I think that if I had to put it simply, many of the Muslim rulers in the Middle East believe that Israel is fighting the same ideas that these leaders are fighting in their own countries. And this is why we find that what Israel is doing in Gaza is not actually done in a way that upsets some of these Muslim leaders, but rather with the proactive support of these Muslim leaders. We saw, for example, that when the ceasefire was announced, we saw reports that when Trump was trying to get Muslims to rebuild Gaza and to support it and the like, we saw that some countries such as Saudi Arabia came out very bluntly and said that if Hamas is not disarmed, and if the Palestinians are not disarmed, we're not going to pay a single penny. This is despite Trump and Turkish President Erdogan, and despite Qataris coming out and saying that this is going to take time, it's not a priority at the moment. Even Trump saying it's not a priority. We had countries such as Saudi Arabia and the UAE, alongside the Israelis, saying we will not allow any redevelopment of Gaza, nor spend any money on Gaza if the Palestinians still have arms at their disposal. There is a very interesting statement that was made by Sudan's leader, not Sudan's leader, but the head of a militia in Sudan, the RSF, the Rapid Support Forces, which is a proxy of the United Arab Emirates that's fighting in Sudan. As part of getting international support, one of his main advisors went on Israeli television and bluntly told Can, which is one of the Israeli channels, that, quote, the reason that Israel and the international community should support us is because we in Sudan are fighting the same terrorist threat that Israel is fighting in Palestine. And this group that is being supported in Sudan by the United Arab Emirates met with the Israeli president in Abu Dhabi, being hosted by Mohammed bin Zayed and the leader of the UAE as well. The simple reason is there is a deep concern in the Middle East. There is a deep concern indeed in the Muslim world more broadly by some in Western capitals that the idea of Islam still manages to unite people across borders. And there is a deep concern that Islam still manages to evoke very strong emotions and bonds that transcend those borders. I mean, you look at, for example, when a non-Bosnian is visiting Bosnia, they're deeply moved by the struggle of their Muslim brothers and sisters in Bosnia as if it is their own family. And I think that concern was particularly manifest when during the Arab Spring, the elections that immediately followed the Arab Spring, we saw that the parties that won the elections were, quite frankly, any party that would wave the flag of Islam. Whether they were truly with Islam or not is a different issue, but anybody who said, I want Islam to play a prominent role in politics, they won the elections. And Nahda in Tunisia, the Mohammed Morsi and the Development, Justice and Development Party in Egypt. When Turkey finally had its first real free and fair elections, Najmuddin Erbakan and the AK Party came to power as well. It's across this particular movement. And there's a deep concern that was expressed by the French President Macron in an interview in 2020 in Le Grand Continent, when he was asked why Western states did not support the democratic transitions in these Muslim worlds. He said it's because when they went to vote in the elections, they expressed, quote, regressive tendencies. And this is why when we're looking at what's happening in Gaza today, the concern amongst many of these Muslim leaders is that if the Palestinians win, then people will say that it is this idea of some Islamic brotherhood that won and managed to stand up against the Israelis. And this is precisely the idea that they're trying to bring down while they try to elevate narrow nationalist ideas. You look at, for example, Saudi Arabia, which changed its dates of founding from 1744 to 1727. 1744, Saudis used to say, is the year that Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab and Al Saud made a deal and established the kingdom. In order to remove the religious element of Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab, the new leader changed the date to 1727, which is when Muhammad Al Saud becomes the leader of his clan. To remove that idea that we Saudis are a tribal Saudi endeavor, it has nothing to do with Islam. You look at the UAE, the amount of money that it spends on cultural events to create a new identity where Islam is not necessarily central. And the one issue that unites every Muslim in the whole world, 2 billion Muslims, quite frankly, is Palestine. It remains the thorn in the side in the creation of these new identities. And that's why we see that it's not only that they're not willing to support the Palestinians, but they proactively want to see the Palestinians defeated. They proactively want to see the Palestinians surrender to the Israeli side because they believe this is not a priority anymore. We need the Israelis to convince Washington to give us nuclear weapons. We need the Israelis to convince Washington to let us build. We need the Israelis to convince Washington to let us have a more open society and the like. And that's one of the greatest tragedies in that this is probably the first time that Israel attacks Palestine, where you find the Arab states are not aligned with the Palestinians, but most of them are far closer to the Israeli position than the Palestinians.
Is this a question of just investment and money, or you've touched on the Muslim question of Palestine, but what I think the Christian population generally in the world doesn't understand is that the Christians, along with the Muslims, are being persecuted in all territories of Palestine. If we take into consideration the Catholic presence there, the Orthodox presence there, and how they're being treated around not just Jerusalem, but across the West Bank, Gaza, the destruction of the church from the 13th century in this onslaught and genocide launched on October 7th.
I think there are two things to mention here. First and foremost, when the Crusaders came and took Jerusalem, they didn't just slaughter the Muslims, they slaughtered the Christians as well. More than 70,000 people were slaughtered when the Crusaders entered. They slaughtered the Christians, Muslims, and the Jews all together, all at once when they entered the Jerusalem. And if anybody is interested, doesn't like reading books, there is a very good film called Kingdom of Heaven. It has Orlando Bloom, where at the final scene, when Orlando Bloom has to hand over Jerusalem to Salah ad-Din, he says to Salah ad-Din, how do I know that you won't do to us what we did to you? In other words, how do I know that you won't kill everybody the way we killed everybody? So historically, this idea of Christians being killed and Christendom ignoring them took place even before. And I think even when we look at what's happening in Ukraine, I mean, I'm from the United Kingdom. Before Russia invaded Ukraine, many Brits wanted to see the Polish and Ukrainians kicked out of the UK. It wasn't seen as something that, you know, we're brothers and Christians and the like. When Russia invaded Ukraine, suddenly the Ukrainian flag is being waved everywhere as well. So I think that these bonds sometimes are quite complicated. But a second alternative reason could be that many Christians simply don't know what's happening in that area. You'll remember, Semir, when Tucker Carlson did his interview with the nun who is in Jerusalem, and how shocked he was to find when she was describing how Zionists treat Christians in that particular area. And note that when an Arab-speaking Christian was making the interviews, it didn't get as much support as when this well-known American nun started speaking about it, and everybody came out and said, oh my God, I can't believe this is happening. I didn't know they spit at Christians on the street. I didn't know this is how they treat them. There's also this element, which I think is more important than the first reason, which is many people don't know. When you think about, Semir, the reason why Zionists are spending $50 billion to buy TikTok, what is it that they are trying to do? They are terrified that the filters that they built on information and how that reaches the Americans, these filters are breaking apart. So they're trying to buy TikTok and trying to buy CBS and trying to buy media in order to make sure that American Christians don't realize what's happening to Christians in Jerusalem and in Palestine and in so-called Israel, because they're terrified if Christians find out, then maybe their position will be very different. I prefer the second reason. Although historically Christians sometimes they tend to abandon each other, which is quite unfortunate given the close bonds between Christians and Muslims more broadly historically and how close they've been historically as well. I do think that the ignorance part of it is is probably the main reason for it. And that's why I think social media has been so transformational in changing the way we talk about Gaza.
We've seen the media being used for the past 20, 30 years in particular, especially after George Bush's launch of the war on terror, to discredit many, not just Muslim intellectuals, but also Westerners. If we go back to Snowden, Julian Assange, people who were whistleblowers in terms of what was going on in Iraq. Do you think that the idea of the Antichrist or the Dajjal in the Islamic version, or the Mahdi and its coming, is being portrayed as a conspiracy theory in order for people to stop believing in these events, despite both the Bible, the Quran foreseeing these things? Because going back to the way the media discredits individuals which do talk about these events, they're depicted as lunatics, as religious fanatics, while we're kind of seeing right now this being displayed, where both me and you know that the Israeli national channels are launching programs for children, how the new Solomon temple should look like. We've seen comments from Ben Gvir, Gantz, Gallant, already Smotrich, already promising Israelis and Zionists in Israel of building this new temple on Mount Al-Aqsa.
I think that that's certainly a great part of it. I mean, you remember the reports about trying to find the red heifers and, trying to sacrifice the red heifers as part of bringing about this sort of, the Messiah coming back again. And indeed, I think this is a prophecy that's shared between the Christians and the Muslims in particular, the idea that there is a second coming of Jesus. Jesus is going to come again, something that both believe quite strongly about. I do think that based on my trips going to America back and forth, I do think that while some evangelical priests certainly believe that and support Israel for that reason, I do think that when a lot of that reasoning is based on an ignorance of what it actually means, and I think that once people read the Bible more clearly, I think you find many priests actually end up changing their mind in that regard. But I do think that this sort of rewriting to give this sort of, God's chosen people, this is what God has decided, this is what God is going to do. God tells the Christians that they have to support Israel and the children of Israel. Something that Tucker Carlson was very surprised with when he interviewed Ted Cruz, when he said to him, "You mean God told us in the Bible to support Netanyahu?" Almost mocking him, telling these aren't the people of Israel that God is mentioning in the book itself. But I think this rewriting of history is something very similar to what we're seeing in the Balkans. This idea when we look at the relationship between whether it's Serbia and Bosnia and Croatia and all of these other different countries that lived together side by side for centuries, you can see that sort of everybody trying to rewrite the narrative in a way that sort of, removes the other from the history books. You are Turks, you don't belong here, or the other version, or the like. The Israel and the evangelicals are playing on this as well. The idea that this is God's chosen people, it always belonged to the Israelis, ignoring the fact that for centuries, Jews, Muslims, and Christians live side by side. Samir, you're in a city that's known as the Jerusalem of Europe. The reason it got the nickname as the Jerusalem of Europe is because once upon a time, the harmonious coexistence of the religions in that city was so amazing and so great that people nicknamed it the Jerusalem of Europe, because it was the same as the Jerusalem of once upon a time, the Jerusalem we talk about today, the Jerusalem once upon a time, whereby people also coexisted side by side. And that's why I think that this suggestion of this Armageddon, that we should support the Israelis because it will make Jesus come, I think that's a minority opinion in terms of why people are supporting the Israelis. I actually think the reason that a lot of Christians support the Israelis is because they're unaware of what that actually means. They're unaware of the reality of what Israel is. They were sold a lie and sold a myth about what Israel is. And the proof is that with the advent of social media and everybody seeing the reality, it's Christians who are turning away from the Israelis. It's Christians who are coming out and saying, I can't support the Israelis no more. It's Christians who, like Candace Owens, who are coming out and saying, you can't say to me as a Christian that my Bible tells me to support the bombing of children the way Israel is doing for the like. It's Tucker Carlson who said 2 days ago and said that when I saw the children with their limbs blown off, if that's what it means to support Israel, then I'm sorry. Me as a Christian and many others, we're out. We're not supporting the Israelis in that regard. And this is what lends me to believe that while they may have been taught through a religious framework that they have to support the Israelis, when the reality is being shown to them, they're realizing that maybe this is not exactly what Christianity meant to be.
Both me and you have had our fair share of growing up in the West. There is a depicted narrative that Muslims hate the West, that Muslims are anti-West, that Muslims are anti-Western civilizations. But at the same time, both me and you know that many people in the West truly are genuine in approaching the matter of question between Islam and the Christian world, and particularly when it comes to the question of Palestine. We're seeing far more protests, pro-Palestinian protests happening in the West than in the Middle East itself. How do you comment to the fact that mass protests are happening in Western societies in support of the Palestinian cause, where this narrative created by media that Muslims are against Western civilization is slowly crumbling?
I think this idea of Muslims being against Western civilization is a very new phenomenon. It's not a historic civilizational fight that everybody claims that it is. I think it's a new phenomenon, and I think it's more a manufactured one. And I think the reason being is that whenever you look more deeply in events across history, you will find that, whether it's in World War II, where Muslims fought alongside the Allies against, Nazi fascism, whether it's, with regards to even in Bosnia where you are at, I went to, Zvornik and some of these places, Bielina and these other places near there, talking to some families about what happened during the war. And everybody, a lot of them have a story about a Serb who put them in the car and drove them out the border to protect them from being killed. I went to Banja Luka, in Bosnia, and I remember asking how some of those mosques were rebuilt. And the imams would tell me that Christians from abroad would donate money to rebuild those mosques and the like. So the stories and examples are endless. There is, even when you look at Bosnia today, you look at, for example, I think it was Ali Izetbegović who famously said, look at how many churches were destroyed. You'll hardly find any compared to those who came and destroyed the mosques. The reality is that the Muslims have never had an issue with the West insofar as it's some sort of ideology, destroy the West. And that's never been the case. And I think that when you look throughout history, you'll see that there's many evidence to prove that. And Gaza is simply the latest in this long, catalog of evidence whereby when you go to those protests, and I've been to these protests, I went to the Million Man March in London and with other protests. I promise you, Semir, they're overwhelmingly not Muslim. When you tell them why you're on the street, they say, I'm standing for humanity. I'm standing for what's right. I can't believe they let this happen. It doesn't matter where you come from. We have to stand for justice. We have to stand for what's right. You've seen, for example, on the street, you have these old men and women being arrested by the police. And then when they're being, dragged into the police car, they shout from the car, we're on the right side of history. You guys keep doing what you're doing. Braver than many Muslims, if we're going to be brutally honest, in terms of what's happening in Gaza and the like. And this is the point here, in that one should never lose hope in that humanity, or even the belief in that humanity. Because I always argue that the reality is that the oppressor always tends to lose, whether it's in colonization, whether it's the French in Algeria, they were kicked out. The Italians in Libya, they were kicked out. The promises to erase Muslims in Bosnia, and eventually they failed in that pursuit. And the reason why I mentioned Bosnia and the Balkans in particular is because you can see that battle of narratives between one side that says that we need to exterminate a certain group of people, they don't belong in the Balkans, and the others who says, guys, we can go back to coexistence. We can go back to Jerusalem of Europe. We can go back to an Andalusian coexistence. We can go back. And it's important that these voices are elevated. In the past, these voices were shunned and they were smothered by a mainstream media that wouldn't allow them to emerge, by a mainstream media that used to put those filters. But now with social media, when people see the reality of the way the Palestinians are speaking, the way they're talking, when they see Christian Palestinians, when they see Jews, young Jews now coming out, voting for Mamdani against the Zionist candidate Cuomo in New York, when they see Jews coming out and saying, if this is Israel, I don't want any part of it. When you see Avi Shleim, the Cambridge professor here, Israeli historian, coming out and saying that the solution is the destruction of the apartheid state and for everybody to be together with equal rights. I think it's abundantly clear that humanity is still alive. I think it's always been alive. It's just that I think that there are certain times when we don't hear them loud enough because they're being smothered. And now with social media, we're hearing them very loudly, thankfully.
Going back to Gaza and what's going on, not just in Gaza, but the continuous push by Zionist forces to completely occupy the West Bank. Events of October 7th are being portrayed by media as this is a starting point for Israel where they have to defend themselves. while at the same time, the suffering of the people of Palestine is already been more for now longer than 70 years. Have the events of October 7th actually unmasked the hypocrisy of rationality when it comes to respecting human rights, when it comes to respecting Geneva Conventions, conventions of war? Do you think that this event actually, for the first time in modern day history, has brought down the mask of hypocrisy within these agreements?
I think that the suggestion that Gaza did it implies that before Gaza, the world believed that human rights was genuinely something that states sought to uphold. The reason why I say that is that, given that we're talking on a channel that, broadcasts to a primarily Balkan audience, everybody knows that in 1992, Mitterrand told Clinton, the US president, the French president Mitterrand told US President Clinton, when Clinton said to him, let's lift the arms embargo, because in Clinton's view, it wasn't affecting Serbs, it wasn't affecting Croats, it was affecting the Bosniak Muslims. So Clinton's opinion was, this is a bit unfair. Let's lift the arms embargo or implement it completely on everybody. And Mitterrand famously said, according to the Taylor tapes, that the idea of a Muslim majority democracy in the heart of Europe is an unnatural phenomenon, and Bosnia does not belong in Europe. And therefore, he said, we would prefer to lock in the disadvantage that these Bosnian Muslims have. These were his words. I think that when you remember that, according to the same Taylor tapes, the British Foreign Secretary at the time famously said that what's happening in Bosnia is tragic, but it's and painful, but necessary for the reconstruction of Christian Europe. Every Bosnian knew this, and so did the world. They knew that this was the position, this was the stance. When Srebrenica was unfolding, everybody knew the reports as it was unfolding. Where is NATO planes? Where are they going? They took off from Italy and they turned back. And it was a great failure of the international community in upholding human rights. You look at, for example, the genocide that took place in Rwanda. You look at, for example, the violation of international law in the war in Iraq. You look at, for example, the violation of international law in the war on Afghanistan. I don't think that Gaza has slipped the mask off. I think what the difference with Gaza is, before we could not see those images, we could only hear them. We could only, it was told to us what was happening. This is the first genocide that's live streamed. This is the first genocide where you don't need historians or archaeologists to go into Srebrenica and find the mass graves and then do DNA tests to prove that the genocide took place. You're seeing live stream the genocide taking place. You're seeing the moment the bullet is fired. You're seeing the moment the body is buried. Not even buried. You're seeing the moment the body falls. You're seeing the moment the limb is blown off. You're seeing it live stream. And that constant stream of information, it's like Obama's former speechwriter was saying in a catastrophic interview that she gave, when she said, when I'm talking to people to defend Israel, I'm talking through a wall of carnage. I'm talking through a wall of dead children. What she means is, before, they weren't seeing anything. So it was my word versus the Palestinian word. But this time people are seeing and saying, hang on a second, I'm seeing this live. No, wait. It's like Tucker Carlson said, that kid looks like my granddaughter or looks like my goddaughter. That kid doesn't deserve to have their arm blown off. This is the first genocide live stream. It's the first genocide that the ordinary person can see directly. It's the first genocide whereby the Palestinian is able to show you directly, without CNN, without New York Times, without BBC, without any of these, two-sidism. Anybody who goes to Srebrenica Memorial, they have a section about the media coverage of Srebrenica at the time, the way they would do both sidism or deny what was happening, and the confusion. Is it happening? Is it not happening? Are people being killed? Is it rumor? Is it not? There's no rumors here, Semir. It's so obvious in front of everybody's phone that they can't deny it. So I don't think it's necessary that the mask fell off. We always knew that human rights was not a priority for many of these states that claim to uphold human rights. But this is the most graphic and raw genocide that we've ever seen with our own eyes. And I think that is what has unsettled a lot of people. To hear is one thing, to see is completely different.
When we continue talking about human rights, and we are seeing a rise of the far right in Europe, we've seen the UK leave the Eurozone, we've seen double standards in terms of how journalists report certain war zones. I myself was in Ukraine before the war started, and then the days after the war started. We've seen Christiane Amanpour there, Clarissa Ward on the Israeli side. They were in Kiev, they were reporting. And then when it came to Gaza, immediately sanctions were put on Russia, on Putin, on Lavrov, on many high officials in Russia. While when it came to Gaza and the Palestinian questions, we didn't see these journalists in Gaza or even in the West Bank, especially after the killing of Al Jazeera's reporter Shireen. Is Europe struggling right now with upholding the standards of human rights if we take into consideration these facts that I mentioned, and also the fact that now people are being arrested in the streets in Germany for saying from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free?
I think that one of the issues I think that the West has when it comes to approaching Israel, I think first, the scepter of the Holocaust still looms. I mean, when you look at the way Germany approaches Israel, it's always this sense of we're guilty of committing a heinous crime, and therefore we have to support the Israelis no matter what. The irony is, it's almost as if Germany is saying, we committed a genocide, you have the right to commit a genocide of your own, which is a very strange position to take. I think that when it comes to the support of the Israelis, I think what's important to note is that the West is not doing anything unusual in its support with the Israelis. Israel remains the last colonial outpost in that particular region. Whenever you look at Israel, whether it's from 1948 onwards, it's always been supported by a Western superpower, the British in order to establish itself, then the Americans and the like and whatnot. I think a lot of that has to do with the way that information is taught in the West with regards to Israel and with regards to the Holocaust and beyond. The second point that is worth noting is that I think that when it comes to journalists going to cover what's happening in Palestine, there's a track record that anybody who speaks about what happens to Israel loses their job. There is a price to pay whenever you talk about Israel in particular. There's a reason why there was an interview Thomas Massie, the Republican congressman, gave to Tucker Carlson. He said AIPAC assigned a babysitter to every single representative in the Republicans. And this babysitter feeds all of the information that they need to say about Israel and demands loyalty towards Israel in terms of what's happening. Ted Cruz, the Republican congressman, said, I was elected to Congress to defend Israel, saying it very categorically and quite bluntly. You look at AIPAC Tracker, which is now listing all of the amount of money that AIPAC gives to those in Congress to ensure that they continue to vote for the Israelis, even at the expense of ordinary Americans. Semir, you've been to America, I've been to America, all these other different places. In Chicago, Magnificent Mile, you have a US veteran, old guy, freezing on the streets, he's homeless. But the reason he can't access funds in order to get out of homelessness is because Congress prioritizes $14 billion to give to the Israelis before it gives it to homelessness. It prioritizes $8 billion to give to the Israelis before it prioritizes an American family that's going bankrupt as a result of medical bills. That's the extent to which AIPAC has managed to create influence in the Congress. It's why Donald Trump told the Financial Times 6-7 months ago, when he said that Israel used to control the Congress, I'm not sure they control the Congress anymore. This is a headline, you can find it yourself, you can even put it up, in which Donald Trump says it on the basis that as a result of the images that the Americans are seeing, they don't like you anymore. They don't like the Israelis anymore. I think that when it comes to journalists, I think despite the talk that they are brave, that, for example, they'll go cover the war in Bosnia, they'll cover the war in Afghanistan, they'll cover the war in Iraq, there's a genuine fear about talking about Israel. There's almost this sense of, if I talk about it, I will be shunned, I will lose my job, I will lose my career, I will be finished, I will never be invited again, I will never be able to speak on TV again. And we've seen journalists pay the price as a result. And that's why I think that this climate of fear that's been created has resulted in very poor reporting. Clarissa Ward, for example, there was that very notorious incident where she went on the ground because she heard a bomb about 2-3 miles away, and they bought the video of a Palestinian where a bomb is 100 meters away, and the Palestinian is there, still sitting, saying, Clarissa, don't overreact in terms of when you're hearing these bombs, because you're not where you are supposed to be. And that's why I think that it is amongst the greatest tragedies that we grew up being taught that bravery and courage in journalism is telling the truth. But when it comes to Israel, the fear of losing your career means people don't tell the entirety of the truth. And the darkest part of it is, Semir, and this is the point that I want to emphasize here, is notice how when Palestinians show what's happening to them, for a long time, Western journalists were saying we need it from credible sources. We need it from credible journalists. We have no journalists on the ground. The Palestinians are showing to you hundreds of Palestinian journalists, but there was this sort of very Orientalist lack of recognition for those particular journalists. It's very similar to the Balkans today, whereby a Bosnian will tell the history of their country, but is shouted down by Christian Schmidt, who told the Mufti, don't exaggerate when you are, commemorating Srebrenica in terms of what's happening. When he told them 2 weeks ago, two years ago, the High Commissioner. It's very similar to when somebody tries to tell, the story of tragedy of what unfolded in these different places, and they're told, shush, shush, this isn't part of the narrative we're trying to push in this region. If you talk about it, you will ruin that narrative. But you never gave the space for that narrative in the first place, which was your job as a journalist. You were supposed to tell those stories. But I think that fear is being broken gradually, not because journalists are getting braver, but because polls show that people have lost so much trust in mainstream media, they're now looking on social media. You've seen that poll, Semir. CNN, it's dropped the viewership. New York Times, it's dropped the subscriptions. BBC, it's dropped. People don't follow mainstream media the way they used to anymore because they feel like they do not get the full picture anymore. Now, most people, I remember Justin Trudeau, the Canadian Prime Minister, saying it's a tragedy now that people are getting their news from social media, and this is a big problem, misinformation. Well, if you had told the truth in the beginning, then no one would go onto social media. And Semir, here is the darkness of what's unfolding before us. Because social media now broke the grip of mainstream media, we now see Australia banning social media use for under 16s. We see the US Congress, Israel First politicians coming out and saying, we need to ban under 16s from using social media. We're now seeing people trying to restrict social media. Why? Because, as Hillary Clinton said, when she said, that TikTok meant that people change their minds on Israel, she was saying, if people won't listen to Israel, then we will make sure they listen to nobody. They either listen to us or we shut down those means of communications. This is the battle that's at hand. And this is what Israel has managed to create for itself. This sort of sense of, if you stand against us, we will destroy you. And that's why I think that what happened after October 7th is a turning point, because that wall of fear is breaking apart as a result of common humanity proving to be much braver than those so-called journalists.
We've seen also the daughter just recently, I can't remember, was it a Texas senator or a Texas congressman who spoke out after her father was invited by the AIPAC to Israel, and she herself came out and actually said that my father took part in a propaganda campaign, essentially, where she went against her father, who is a U.S. official. And we're seeing more and more, as you said, journalists kind of throw in the towel, people resigning from the BBC, people resigning from The Guardian, the New York Times, Reuters, very credible, or at least have been in the past as reporters. When we describe, for example, the Rohingya, the Gaza, the Bosnia, the Rwanda, do you think that the narrative with the coming youth, despite attempts of trying to censor social media, is going to fail?
I think that we're entering a new age of information. I think the reality is that with the advent of social media, with the decentralization of information, with the rapid advancement in technology, AI and the like, I think the ease with which we communicate with one another, whereby you can just stick your iPhone on and go live stream and communicate with the whole world and people can go, I think with the reality of the market economy, whereby, yes, the social media can censor maybe 100,000 accounts, maybe 1 million accounts, but as that social media company knows, if it censors 1 billion accounts, it goes bankrupt. It makes no capitalist sense in order to censor all of that. And that's the point about everybody speaking out, everybody raising their voices. You make it impossible for oppressors to silence you, which is why despite the 50 billion in TikTok and the shadow banning and all this, people are still hearing the news about Palestine. People are still hearing the news about Gaza. People are now rewriting the story of what happened in Bosnia. People are now rewriting the story of what happened in terms of the coexistence with the Serbs and the Bosniaks and the Croats and the Slovenes and the like. People are rewriting the story of Palestine, no longer recognizing that Israel had the right to exist. We're now moving towards this idea that Israel doesn't have the right to exist and the land belongs to Palestinians and people should just live together. All of that is happening so rapidly over the past 2 years because of the decentralization of information. But more importantly, I think that because people have lost faith in those who told us the story of the world before, people are now proactively going to try to find what the world actually looks like today. People are proactively going on the ground, like yourself, Semir. I know you have some wild stories, and we've discussed this at length many a times over a cup of coffee. But for example, people are going out on the streets and saying, wait a minute, this doesn't look like how I was told it looks like. This story is not the way that I was told this story was. And people are now telling those stories, and people are able to watch those stories. People are looking for it, and they're reconnecting with the reality of what's happening and rediscovering the truth. And as they rediscover the truth, that global order is beginning to collapse in and of itself. When people talk about China, Russia, US, etc., it's not that China, Russia, and these others are getting stronger. Rather, what it is, people are losing faith in this sort of fanciful world that was presented to everybody, that everything is okay, even as millions of people are being killed. Everything is okay, even if genocide is unfolding in Srebrenica. Everything is okay, even if genocide is being committed in Prijedor. Everything is okay, even if Rwandans are being killed. Everything is okay, even if Rohingya are on boats desperately trying to go into Bangladesh or Malaysia in order to save themselves from this assault that's taking place by an army that, and the prime minister of the time is a Nobel Peace Prize winner, Aung Suu Kyi and the like. But because she was such a darling of the West, nobody wanted to focus on the Rohingya for so long. So people are fed up with that. People are saying, I'm no longer going to take information as it is. I'm going to go and discover it ourselves. And now through new media, we're able to have the tools through which to convey that information. I think it's an irresistible wave. And that's why I think that when you look at just today, I was reading that Karim Khan, the ICC prosecutor, said that he was threatened by the UK that if he went ahead with the arrest warrant for Netanyahu, Britain would withdraw funding from the ICC. That information is being leaked, and you can't suppress that information anymore. And that's why I think in that regard, I think that the future looks much brighter. The future looks much better. The future looks much braver. It looks much more courageous. You look at how people have come out for Gaza. You look at how people have come out for Palestine, across all religions, across all political leanings, left, right, up, down, Jew, Christian, Muslim, Hindu, whoever, everybody coming out for Gaza for the sake of humanity. It shows you no matter how much money the oppressor has, humanity is still alive and can still actually make that difference. And I think anybody in the Balkans can appreciate that. When a country like Bosnia was abandoned by the world, but still manages to survive today, not through superiority of means, but through heart and a belief that humanity can be better than hate, that despite that hatred, you were asking earlier about the rise of the far right. And this is the last part of the question that I want to address in this regard. That far right is feeding off of people who are neglected economically. I'm from the UK. I've been across the UK. I'm telling you, Semir, there are some very serious economic issues. There are people who have been neglected. It's a government that took away the winter fuel allowance, which many families rely on to have heating during the winter. And hundreds of families here will not have heating during this very cold winter because the government says it doesn't have money to do so, but it does have money to help the rich with regards to their investments. So when the right wing comes out and says, all your problems are because of Muslims and because of immigrants and because of whatever, part of me doesn't blame that poor Englishman for believing it when he is somebody destitute and abandoned and desperately looking for any hope, but that hope doesn't exist, so he clings on to hatred. And I'll say something here, Semir. I've been across Republika Srpska in Bosnia, even though I don't necessarily recognize it as an entity. But I've been across the areas known as Republika Srpska. I have seen the lack of development. I have seen these Serb families that are struggling economically. I have seen these Serb families that are struggling to make ends meet, and many of them leaving the country, leaving the Bosnia in order to try to make ends meet everywhere. They have the same problem. The offer being made to them is that, guys, you can survive your economic crisis by hating somebody else. And that's why I argue one of the most beautiful things that I've seen in Bosnia is when Bosnians go to these areas, when they reject the language of hate, when they go and rebuild, when they go and support, when they go and help, when they extend their arm to those who once hated them, when they say, let's rebuild Jerusalem of Europe again, let's rebuild once more. And I've seen these people. I've seen them in Foča. I've seen them in Banja Luka. I've seen them in Zvornik. I've seen them in all these Bijeljina. I've seen them in all these places. People who go and say that we are going to adopt the Muslim message of being a mercy to mankind. When the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam went to Taif to convince them and they stoned him, he prayed that they would be guided, and he went back to them and they became guided and they became a firm pillar of support for him later on. There are people who still believe in these stories, Semir. There are people who still believe in that hope. There are people who still believe these hearts can flip. There are people who still believe love can come out of a heart of hatred. There are people who still believe that American racists who used to hate Muslims, today, Semir, you're seeing them today coming out in support of Palestine. Semir, Tucker Carlson was in an interview saying that when 9/11 happened, I was told that Islam is evil, so I said Islam is evil. I was told Muslims are a threat to America, so I said Muslims are a threat to America. But you know what he said? Recently, I've been looking into Islam because of what happened after October 7th. Did you know that Islam means surrender? Surrender to God? That's such a lovely concept. As a Christian, I like that. I don't have a problem with a Bangladeshi. I don't have a problem with a Pakistan. The opinion is changing because love triumphs over hate. And this is the point here. What the right wing are terrified of, they're not terrified because they believe, or what the right wing believe. The right wing don't believe they're winning. What they're terrified of is not some immigrant takeover or Muslim takeover. What they're terrified of is that when Semir meets the Englishman says to Semir, hey, you're not like how they painted you in the media. Hey, you're not like, hey, you joke, hey, you laugh. Hey, you're actually a good guy. That's what they're terrified of. They're terrified that when that Serb who's fed the hatred from Dodik and fed the hatred of those who wanted to commit genocide and supported it, when they finally go and meet those who they were told to hate, it takes some time, but eventually they say, I'm a bit surprised. I was taught that you had horns on your head. I was taught you were evil people, but you laugh and you joke and you eat and you drink like the rest of us. This is what the far right are so terrified of. What they want is to keep us divided because in our bubbles, hatred thrives. They're terrified that if we actually speak to each other and come together and communicate with one another, that will dispel that hatred. And I finish on this point, Semir, in case anybody thinks that I'm painting some sort of optimistic scenario. Consider this for a second, Semir. $50 billion to buy TikTok. That's how much the Zionists spent to silence those who are speaking for Palestine. $50 billion. Semir, did anybody pay you even $1 billion to go out and speak for Palestine? Did anyone pay a Bosnian or a Serb or a Croat or a Slovene or a Brit or a Frenchman or an Italian or an Australian or an American or a Nigerian or a Burkina Faso or a Kazaki or a Uzbeki or a Japanese, so many protests, or in Korea? Did anybody pay them even close to $1 million, forget 1 billion, to go out for Palestine? No. Meaning the action that they did for free defeated a propaganda machine worth more than 50 billion. And this is the point, in that it's not about material resources. It's about what's magnificent about the reaction to what's happening in Gaza, to the genocide, is that when humanity stands up and roars, no matter how much money is put into propaganda, it collapses. It's what you meant when you said the mask has fallen off. And I think that the future looks bright. Why? Because people are now rejecting the rules of the old world. They're rejecting the rules of this false international order. They're now saying, wait a minute, they told us to hate each other. They told us to despise each other. But now I realize they were doing it to commit genocide. They were doing it so they could send 14 billion to Israel while I starve. They were doing it to oppress me. I'm not going to believe them anymore. Come and sit with me. They told me to hate you. I'm actually a bit curious as to why they wanted me to hate you. This is a golden opportunity, Semir, to break the walls of hatred they put between us. And I think that we are the generation, hopefully, that will be able to take full advantage of this and redraw and create a more happier world than this disgusting one that was created for us.
God willing, inshallah. You've recently had your own struggles in the United States, despite having a valid multi-entry visa. You were arrested, and from the outside perspective, from us following you and knowing you, it was like, why Sami being arrested while prior everybody had open access to the things that you were saying? Many media tried to portray you as a threat in the narrative which you were talking about. And if we go back to the Ottoman times, Sultan Abdul Hamid Han, in a sense, created the Hijaz in order to have Europeans meet these Muslims, which were portrayed even back then as a threat to the Christian world. Did you see your own arrest in the United States as a censorship, as a way to stop the narrative and prevent you from introducing Muslims and the narrative of Palestine to a Christian or an evangelical audience or a Western audience in the United States?
Samir, I'll tell you a funny story that I heard. So I asked a friend of mine in Georgia, in the US, the state of Georgia in the US, I said, guys, explain to me how the Congresswoman Marjorie Taylor Greene ended up, becoming so, supportive of the cause of the Palestinians. Like, what happened? So aside from the pictures and images that she saw because everybody was sharing, somebody said to me that a Muslim has visited her and said to her, we thank you for you coming out and, saying as well the images. And then they told her the story of Najashi when the Muslims went to Abyssinia to seek refuge and they spoke to the Christian king. And he was shocked to hear about how Muslims speak about Jesus. And he asked them to read from the Quran. He said to them, what does your book say about Jesus? And they read what the Quran says about Jesus. And then Najashi, King Najashi, the Christian king, he drew a line in the ground and he said, the difference between you and us is no thicker than this line. We are so similar to each other in that regard. They told me when Marjorie Taylor Greene heard the story, she went, I had no idea that Muslims and Christians had this kind of history. I had no idea that this existed in that regard. I went to every state in America except New Hampshire. I'd go to these areas that, you would consider no-go zones, for any immigrant or the like. You have a conversation and you start realizing they don't know much about what's happening in the world. When they start seeing the images, I can't believe this is happening. I can't believe. I found them to be good people who just didn't know much about what was happening, which kind of made me feel ashamed that I should be doing more in that regard. But of course, the battle is harder when you have all these filters and mainstream media silence you in that regard. The reason why I start with this is my arrest, even though it was an attack from Dinesh D'Souza, a right-wing, very hard right-wing individual, nasty, racist individual. Ted Cruz, the senator from Texas, came after me as well. And then Laura Loomer, all of these are Israel First politicians, these Israel First group who came out trying to strike fear in the hearts of people to get them to stop speaking about Palestine. But this wasn't about me, Semir, because I wasn't the first target. The first target were American citizens. They went after American citizens first. They tried to take US citizens to court for criticizing Israel. So they dragged American Muslims for Palestine in courts in Michigan, and they lost. The Zionists, they lost. The judge said, I don't understand. There seems to be foreign influence here. I need to investigate this first. And the Attorney General, she dropped the charges against the US citizens. Then the Zionists went after US citizens in Nevada. They dragged these US citizen students in the courts, saying they were criticizing the Israelis, and it made, Zionists feel unsafe. The judge threw the case out. The judge said, this is a land of freedom of speech. This is nonsense. Then the Zionists said, oh my God, I'm struggling to go after US citizens and they're listening too much to these social media stuff and whatnot. Let's go after naturalized citizens. So they threatened Mehdi Hassan. They said, we're going to get rid of his passport. And they failed. Then they thought, okay, fine, let's go after green card holders. They went after Mahmoud Khalil and the federal judge said, he can't be deported. He can't be detained. Let him go free. Then they went after student visas, Rumeisa Ozturk and Mohsen Mahdawi of Colombia, and they were both released by federal judges. Then the Israel First group said, oh my God, this is so bad. Because of American freedom of speech, Americans are listening to these Palestinian activists. They're listening to these videos on social media. They're listening to these, people who are sharing this content from Bosnia, London, Kuala Lumpur, Paris, Berlin, Rome, Italy, all these places. They're listening to them, and American public opinion is changing. The polls are showing that Israel is now more unpopular than it's ever been before. People are now saying that they shouldn't support the Israelis. Candidates for Congress are now saying, we're not going to take AIPAC money. We need to do something. We need to strike fear in people's hearts. We need to show them we still have some power. We are collapsing, but we need to show them we have some power. I know there is a guy from the UK. He's giving lectures in America. He's here on a visitor's visa, B1, B2. Let's grab him. Maybe that will create some fear, and then we can continue from that. So they grabbed me in San Francisco. The point is, it wasn't about Sami Hamdi. It was about how do we silence voices that Americans are listening to. Semir, I was not the target. The target was the American people. Israel is going after the American people. It's going after the British people. It's going after the French people. It's going after the entire world population, because they are terrified that for the first time, now that there is direct access between us and the populations, direct access between us and Samantha in California and Stephen in Texas and, Marco in, Marseille and, Frederick in Frankfurt or Cologne. Now that there is direct access, there's no intermediary. There's no, mainstream presenter who's filtering what I say or the like. Now there is direct contact. The world is shifting and people's opinions are actually changing. And that's why when they put me in that facility and they detained me and the like, the federal judges within 10 days, 2 federal judges said, we believe there's serious concern that there is something related to freedom of speech here and infringement of freedom of speech. We're going to expedite his case to look into it. That's when the American government came and said, this has gone a bit out of hand, a bit out of proportion. Mr. Hamdi will pull some strings. You can go home and then just apply for a visa again and come back once more. The reason being is there were those who were America first, who were unhappy at what happened to me, saying that we shouldn't be doing all this for the sake of a foreign government. We shouldn't be going after all this for the sake of Israel. That American rights actually matter. Freedom of speech actually matters. You know, freedom to be able to communicate actually matters. All of this, the reason why I mention it in this way is what happened to me was not a defeat. It was proof the Zionists are losing. It's proof that the American public opinion is shifting. The quick, rapid pace at which I was released proves that American public opinion is shifting. And that's why I think that when I went to America, I was unsure what I would find. When I came back from America, Semir, believe me, people are now saying things they were not saying 2 years ago. They're now having discussions they weren't having 2 years ago. They're now speaking in language that would have been forbidden 2 years ago. That's been broken because everybody is now talking. Everybody is now speaking. Everybody's able to see the information for themselves. And when they see that information, their opinions are now beginning to change. And it gives me hope for what the future looks like. It makes me believe that wherever you see hatred, it can flip in less than 18 months, so long as there is a coordinated campaign of people raising their voices and speaking about what a different world could look like. Think about what the Palestinians are saying. They're not saying we hate America. They're saying, America, look at what's happening to us. Do you as human beings condone what is happening to us? And the Americans are beginning to say, no, we don't. We don't like this. We don't support this. We're going to vote Mamdani against Cuomo. We're going to go and support, we're going to go against AIPAC. We're going to, the Americans are changing in that regard. And so is here in the UK, where you have Britain now recognizing the Palestinian state, despite a government that is pro-Zionist, because they're worried about the shift in public opinion in the UK. Macron recognizing Palestine, not because he likes Palestinians, because he knows in the French election, Mélenchon came first in the last election because of the anti-genocide vote. And Macron is concerned that French public opinion is changing. He doesn't want to get caught out. Let me recognize Palestine. You have, for example, Spain recognizing Palestine, Norway recognizing Palestine. You have Denmark divesting, Norwegian Sovereign Wealth Fund divesting from Israel. You have non-Muslims joining these boycotts. You have Starbucks share price dropping as a result of boycott. McDonald's share price dropping as a result of boycott, which allows Bash and these other companies to take advantage in the Balkans and Sarajevo and these other places. But the point that I'm saying is, what's at the crux of this, Semir? The crux is that people began to shout louder and they had the means to reach the world. And what the reason that fills me with optimism is, despite having been arrested, I know that it was a lashing out from an Israel First lobby that is getting weak, not a manifestation of strength from a lobby that is supposed to be strong. They are getting weaker. Humanity is getting stronger. And I think with the rapid shift that we've seen in the Western world, it makes me think, even for the Balkans, maybe, if enough people can talk about a new vision for what the Balkans could look like, beyond the hatred that's been fed. A baby is not born with hate, Semir. A child is not born to hate. A child is born good. Hatred is taught. It's not inherited. Hatred is taught. Is there a way where you could be just as loud about a new vision for what the Balkans could look like, for what that relationship could look like between the Muslim, between the Orthodox, between the Catholics, between the Serbs, between the Croats, between the Bosniaks? Is there a way where the same formula that was used for Palestine, in which the language of hatred has been emphatically destroyed as a result of humanity coming out, maybe there's hope yet for places that we 3 years ago were saying were completely hopeless?
Sami, thank you for your time. And I think I'll be speaking for the both of us when I say that from the Jerusalem of Europe, Sarajevo, we wish peace, tranquility, liberty, and knowledge for all Christians, Jews, wherever they might be, that we as Muslims, both of us as journalists and people in this profession, want to actually get this message across, not just to our audience here in the Balkans, but across the whole world, that Muslims in general are forbidden to hate by the order of God, whoever that might be. And I sincerely appreciate your time. I think the people in the Balkans will be very happy to hear your voice. And based on your last question, in terms of the Balkans, I am very hopeful that there are Serbs in Serbia, Croatians in Croatia, Serbs and Croatians in Bosnia and Herzegovina who do have a positive thought of the future. I think we're facing a very similar problem and couldn't be isolated from that problem, is that normal people are being silenced because the money of those who are financing the contrary narrative is much bigger than our pockets. But I think with projects like Plenum, we are moving those borders beyond, and our platform has been able to gather writers who are Orthodox, Serbian, Croats who are Catholic, Muslims, and it's become a space which is there to serve a narrative that all people have equal rights to say what they think and to push forward for a peaceful future rather than a bloody one. Thank you very much, Sami. I am very happy to see that you're well. Say my salams to your community and your family, and I hope to see you in Sarajevo again.
Inshallah, I'll see you very soon in Sarajevo. Yeah, we have to go to Church for our coffee.
And cevapi, bro. Don't forget the cevapi.
Yeah. Take care, Visa. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Sami.
Take care.
To je bila emisija Plenum Grid sa Semirom Sejfovićem i večerašnjim gostom Samijem Hamdijem. Želim vam svima mir, znanje i ljubav u domovima vašim, u zajednicama vašim, pa se čujemo, vidimo u budućnosti samo na plenumu.ba.